Hello, this is a video about when to use the subjunctive in Spanish. It will be the first of series of several videos on this topic. It's a topic that takes some time to cover, and really the thing with this is there is no clear-cut rule. Um, what I can give you at best is some guidelines, which together with experience of listening and reading the language will give you a very good feeling of when to use subjunctive. Now, that said, let's start looking at it. So, today, what we will look at is subordinate clauses. In what kind of subordinate clauses do we use the subjunctive? So, first of all, to use the subjunctive, as I have here, we need a different subject. So, to say it differently, I have one subject in my main clause and a different subject in my subordinate clause. What exactly does this mean? Well, let's look at this phrase over here, what I'm going to make blue now. Yeah, I don't want you to say the truth. So just to be absolutely clear, the phrase that can stand on its own, I don't want, yeah, this can stand on its own. This is the main clause. You to say the truth, this is my subordinate clause. Why is it subordinate? You to say the truth doesn't really stand on its own. Yeah, that's why it's subordinate. It's subordinated to another clause, to another phrase. So notice here I have two different subjects. What is the subject of want? I. What is the subject of say here? You. You say the truth. Not I, but you. Contrast this with this one here. You don't want to say the truth. Again here, you don't want is my main clause. It's my independent clause, the one that stands alone. To say the truth is the one that needs to be subordinated. It doesn't really stand on its own. So here, however, I have the same subject. You don't want, you want, you say the truth. Yeah, so the subject is the same in both situations. In this second situation, in Spanish, I won't use the subjunctive. That's the main thing I want to get across here. Now, there is another thing that has to do with the kind of the verb. So to use the subjunctive in a subordinate clause, I need two conditions. The first is what we just said, that the subject is different. The second has to do with the quality of the verb. But for now, to be sure we understand what we're talking about, let's look at some examples and then we'll look at the verbs. If I'm going to translate this first phrase, I don't want you to say the truth. How will I do it? Well, no quiero, that should be quite uncontroversial. I don't want. And here I will put the subjunctive. I will always have que in front of my subjunctive when I'm using a subordinate clause, always. No quiero que digas. What could be a mistake to say here? Let me write it here. If I say this, no quiero que dices la verdad. This is grammatically incorrect. It's an ungrammatical phrase in Spanish, yeah? We cannot really say this. So, why? Because I have, again, my two conditions to use the subjunctive. The quality of the verb, which we will look at in a second, and different subjects. But if I have the second phrase, you don't want to say the truth, here, when I have the same subject, that's very important, I will use the infinitive. Just the infinitive. So, what could be a mistake to say here? I mean, the correct phrase, first of all, is no quieres decir la verdad. The mistake, which often appears when students write, is something like, again, no quieres que dices, or even que digas would also be a mistake here. Both of these would be a mistake. Only the infinitive would be correct here. Okay, so this is about the subject. Now let's look at the quality of the verb. Let's take two different English phrases. I think you are telling the truth. We have here, yeah. And then I have also, I don't think you are telling the truth. Now, these phrases look very similar, but in Spanish, they will be, one will be with the subjunctive and the other will be with the indicative. Some people will tell you that this goes with the no creo, the I don't think phrase, goes with the subjunctive because it shows something subjective. But if you think actually about it, is when I say I don't think, is this more subjective than saying I think? I mean, I think itself is not a very objective thing to say. I'm not saying I know, I'm saying I think. So my suggestion here is just to learn it the way it is. Don't try too hard to make sense out of it. We look at which verbs use this, but you just have to learn which verbs go subjunctive and which don't. Don't try too hard to understand, let's say here. It's just the way the language works. So the first one, so we said, I don't think you're telling the truth. No creo que digas la verdad. Well, again, of course, the subject rule has to apply, and it does apply, yeah? Creo, the subject is I, yo, and digas, the subject is you, too. So this applies, of course, it always has to apply to use it. But also I have no creo here, so I will use a subjunctive. However, here, again, I have different subjects, but because the verb is creo, and not no creo, it's not in the negation that is, I will simply use the indicative. So now it's time to look at which verbs use the subjunctive. So first of all, I have a big group of verbs. Verbs like dudar, temer, that show some emotion, something. I wrote here something subjunctive, but I meant to write something subjective, of course. So, like hope, doubt, fear. They have to do with some emotion, and I'm including hope there, yeah? All these verbs, and these are the verbs that are easier to recognize, will go with subjunctive in Spanish. On top of that, however, we have some verbs that express an opinion, like creer and pensar. And these verbs, when in the negation, they will require a subjunctive in the subordinate clause. So just trying to wrap this up, what we looked at today is just a fraction of when we use subjunctive, but it is a very important fraction. It's maybe the part that is hardest for students to understand, and it's something that appears very often, which is the subjunctive in subordinate clauses. And I have two conditions to fulfill here. One is the subordinate clause and the main clause have different subjects. And the second condition I have to fulfill here is that the verb of the main clause has to belong to these specific groups of verbs that require the subjunctive. And that's it, we're done.